Hey, Kathy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brittany. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is so nice to have you. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from my office at Femasys in Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia. Is there a lot of FemTech in Atlanta?
No, not really.
Oh,
We're, I
so.
think, the only one that I'm aware of, but there's not really a lot of FemTech in general. So
Yeah. There's definitely some hot spots showing up, but Atlanta, Georgia, I think I know of one, maybe two startups in the Georgia area. So thanks for holding down the fort for us there.
Yep.
Well, let's kick off the interview with learning more about you and your background. Where are you from? What did you go to school for? If you did, and you're now the CEO of a publicly traded company. So that must be a crazy journey. Just kind of give us some highlights about yourself.
So I'm originally from the New York, New Jersey area. I came to Atlanta in 1995 and joined my first startup. Prior to that, I got my bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Rutgers, so State University of New Jersey, and ended up getting my MBA from the same university and went straight into medtech and worked for a larger company called Terumo, which was at the US headquarters, and then moved to Georgia and have been here ever since, and started Femasys in 2004.
Was it your first company you started?
It is my first company.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. When my first startup died, my lead investor said, "Oh, now you're a real entrepreneur," because
you have a loss in the column.
Lost all his money and other people's, and I had to close it and wonder who I was or what I was going to do. So apparently his definition is not like the law, though, because obviously you've done it and you haven't failed. You've been wildly successful. So that's so cool. So how long have you been working at Femasys?
So since 2004, so coming up on 18 years.
Holy moly, that's amazing. You're like one of the older FemTech companies, like way before FemTech was a word,
Yep. And I'm thrilled that we're starting to see words like FemTech and people interested in women's health. It's certainly helping us.
Was the company always called Femasys?
I named the company, yes, and it was always called Femasys.
Oh my gosh, this is so cool. Usually there's like, oh yeah, and we pivoted and we changed, and then we bought it back, like, all this stuff. So interesting. Well, what does Femasys do?
So we are classified as a biomedical company, but in essence, what it means is we're developing technologies explicitly for women. We're targeting the in-office environment for our application of our products. So not the hospital, not the surgery center. We're looking at office-based products. And I am the lead inventor on all of the technologies at Femasys as well. So it's very deliberate what we're working on, very intentional. We internally conceive. I've signed everything over to Femasys, and then we develop it, put it through our research program. And we also have our own in-house manufacturing at our facility. So multiple clean rooms. So all of our products are manufactured at our facility.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of infrastructure, but it's a true startup story. We started out of my home for a few years and then graduated to a facility, and on we went. But that was really important for me to not just look at the products, but how are we going to bring them to market?
How did you learn how to make medical devices and stuff?
So I was in med tech at a number of companies, three primarily, before I started Femasys. And a couple of them were startups. So I got to see it from its ground level, look at the investment piece of it to R&D and production, and then full-blown manufacturing and what that takes to, what all of that's entailed. And I always wanted to make sure that we had the infrastructure, that we wouldn't be beholden to someone else. I didn't want to be virtual. And I wanted to make sure we had more than one product also, not a pure play, but have a pipeline so we could feed it ourselves and make sure we had lots of products to bring to the market. So those were some of the initial goals. So we're doing that.
You are doing it. It's growing. I want to talk about each of the products you have and like kind of the why does the world need it? But before we do that, I'd love to stick on this founder journey a little bit more because it's so unique. It's so cool. At what point did you get funding? Did you fundraise before you went public, or was going public your fundraiser? Tell us about that journey.
Yeah, we definitely fundraised before we went public. We just went public.
June
of 2021.
Okay.
So prior to that, it was all private placements, and I did my first round, which is very typical of a startup. It was more of a family and friends round. It's about $1 million. And then we went on from there, and fundraising was pretty regular for us, smaller amounts, frequent, until we got a little bit further along in the 2016, 2017 timeframe, where we raised a larger bolus of capital. And then we didn't raise again till the IPO. So we've, just really put our capital to good use, very capital efficient, good stewards of the money that we're raising, feel very strongly that when you take someone's dollar, it's like your own, and you need to put it to good use. And so we've been very grateful for the investors that have supported us. I mean, it's hard being women's health. It's not the darling of the venture community. So it was tricky. And we did raise primarily from family offices.
Okay.
And we did also have a strategic come in on our round before IPO. Medtronic invested in the company. So that was really great. It kind of really, good housekeeping seal of approval to have the largest med tech company in the world come in on one of your rounds. So
really, did you pitch to VCs? Did you pitch to VCs and they just didn't get it, or?
We did. I pitched to a lot of VCs, actually. They were really good about always wanting to take the meeting. There were a few things that made it tricky. One of our products, and we haven't gotten into that yet, but the product I started the company to advance is a permanent birth control option in office. The bar I set for us was to develop something safe and as natural as possible for women, do no harm, for something that's a basic healthcare need. And at the time when I started the company, there were other companies working in the space, and we did have one that didn't fare very well, had a lot of safety issues, was very, it was on every TV station. It just became very well known. You're probably aware of it. It's a coil product, and that was kind of a dead on, same indication. And we took a very different approach from all of those types of approaches, putting a permanent implant into the tube. We don't create our blockage that way. I can explain how we do it, but we were so different that I think people had a hard time kind of getting around it and going, well, if all these companies are doing it this way and you're the only one doing it this way, maybe you're not onto something. So, we are the one that's remaining now, and we're the one fighting the fight to be the option for women, because right now all that women have is surgical tubal ligation, which has been around since the 1800s. So that is the only option for women today worldwide. And so, FemBloc is the name of the product, has the opportunity to really change that for women.
I cannot wait to get more into that. That is a topic we haven't touched on in this show yet, which is crazy to me. When I first started the podcast, I thought, I wonder if I'll have enough people to interview for a year. And now we're going on number 3, third year, So I'm like, oh, no. And we still have topics I haven't talked about. So yeah, we'll never stop the show. Probably. I'm so obsessed with it. It's interesting you're saying that there was another kind of coil permanent sterilization product that had a lot of lawsuits and issues, and it was in the news, and it kind of hurt a lot of people that around it, right? And that's similar. I see that with single blood drop tests. People are like, oh, is this Elizabeth Holmes? Is this Serranos? Or with vaginal mesh. Oh, you're going to put mesh in there. Mesh is the worst. Mesh, everyone's heard those lawsuit commercials late at night. Have you suffered from vaginal mesh, And so it's unfortunate, but also awesome that you've persevered through that, because women deserve all the things, and they deserve things that work and that are good for us. And so it's good that those other ones are stopped, but it's bad that everyone gets kind of nervous around it. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Did you ever see yourself being the CEO of a publicly traded company? What's it been like?
I actually did see myself getting to this point. I prepared for a number of years to run a public company. I really worked really hard to make sure I knew what that was going to take and what was going to be involved, and embraced it. And it just turned out to be the right timing when we went public. It's been a little bit difficult post the public offering for all micro cap and small cap stocks, but it really, it's helping us have access to capital we wouldn't have otherwise. It's allowing me to get the word out about what we're doing, about me, my journey to the products, which is the most important part of this, and what that could stand to do for women's health around the world.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have had that opportunity without having a public vehicle. So it really was essential for us. So I always envisioned it as a possibility in the grand plan.
Cool, cool. Well, let's jump into it. What are all the products that y'all have? And then let's kind of dive into them one by one. But tell us about all the products first, a little bit, like overview.
We have two main products focused in reproductive health. And we looked at two ends of the spectrum. So we have that permanent birth control product, which I mentioned, called FemBloc. And in these categories, there's a lot of commonality in that what we find is antiquated options. They're very old, there's limited in everything that we're doing. So we have the potential to change standard of care to like bring us into the current day as far as technology. So that permanent birth control is on one end, and then we're working on what we call our front end of infertility, something on the affordable end of care. A lot of innovation has happened with IVF. It's a more expensive end of care. Most women never get there. And so our goal was to bring something forward on that front end and kind of revolutionize that. So those are the two main product initiatives. Within those categories, we also have diagnostic products. So we are the developers of FemVue, and that has been on the market. And we're really, really pleased with that product and how well it's doing and how many women that we're helping. But we don't have a sales force domestically. There's nothing commercial, but we are selling quite a few of these FemVues because they're really helpful for women. And in this case, we've replaced age-old technology as well. Before our product, women needed to go by referral to a radiology center to have her tubes evaluated, which is an essential part of the infertility examination. You know, what could be the issue with her being infertile? And sometimes, it's been quoted up to 30% of the time, it's the fallopian tubes actually. So the only way they could view them is a radiologist, radiology, under fluoroscopy, x-ray dye, etc. And we're, again, the first folks to develop a product that would deliver natural saline and air contrast, or bubbles. And we're able to visualize the tubes with ultrasound, and we're able to use any existing ultrasound. So physicians can conduct this exam and look at all female factors in the same visit.
Wow. And that's the FemVue.
That is the FemVue. Yep.
That is so amazing. What can, sorry to interrupt you. Is that all the products before I start asking questions?
No, there's more. So, and FemVue is essential prior to doing a therapeutic option, right? So if we're going to try to get someone to get pregnant by way of an intrauterine insemination approach, you would need to know you have at least one fallopian tube open. So there's a lot of synergy in the product offerings. On the other end of the spectrum, when we talk about permanent birth control, it was really important for us to look at developing what we think is an ideal solution for this problem. What we didn't want to fall short is have women have to go to radiology to have a confirmatory test. And that was the case for the predecessor product, the coil. And so we advanced this technology so that she can come back to the same provider in the office and have a confirmatory test that's under ultrasound and actually get that level of assurance that it worked for her before she relies on it for who knows how long to come. So those are our two reproductive health products. We also have a product for tissue sampling, and what we developed, and again, it's another example of something that's going to replace very age-old technology. And this product is also cleared the regulatory milestones like FemVue. So we're commercializing it this year. Post our IPO, we're now able to bring forward the manufacturing, but it is an endocervical sampler. So it samples the cervix. So for earlier detection of cervical cancer. So if somebody has an HPV test that's concerning or a pap smear that's concerning, tissue sampling is generally required. And this is an advancement in that category. And so we'll continue development for products like these that are targeting the OB-GYN in the office environment. So all of them kind of fit that same criteria.
Oof, I have questions about all of these because they are so interesting to me. All right. So endocervical sampler, how is it different from a pap smear? Isn't that what a pap smear is? It takes a sample of the cervix.
It does, but it doesn't go through full laboratory testing. So it's more of a preliminary screening. So when that comes back suspicious, or if there is a problem with the HPV test, that's when a cervical sample needs to be taken. And that's when it's more tissue and it's sent through for laboratory processing. It's often done with what's called colposcopy, which is when they visualize the cervix, which can be challenging to pick up cancerous cells since it's a small canal. So the sampling is an important part of that overall. So it's, cervical cancer rates are down, fortunately, because of HPV testing. That's wonderful. But when somebody has an issue, the tissue sampling is really important.
Yeah. What are we doing now? How do we?
The tissue sampler that's on the market is called a Kevorkian, believe it or not.
Okay.
And the canal is just a round circular tube, envision like a pipe. And the Kevorkian is a rectangular metal product. And they physically have to scrape it into a basket, and we have a device that's round that goes with the tissue, and it contains the sample in the device, so there's minimal contamination and it's a fairly pain-free procedure.
That is incredible. As you said, like you just described, what I would presume to be a torture device is a current standard of care. So thank you for what you're doing in making our experience better in the OB-GYN, which is already relatively uncomfortable a lot of times. Let's talk about the FemVue for a second. I'll go backwards. So FemVue, using bubbles and ultrasound to look at the fallopian tube health. Can you start by telling us what can be wrong with fallopian tubes?
Sure. So as a result of STDs, gonorrhea, chlamydia, women can have blocked tubes, and majority of the time they're asymptomatic. They have no idea that they have a blockage, and you really only have to have one tube to conceive, but you need to have at least an open tube. So about 30% of the time, the tube is the suspicious factor. It can be an issue in the uterine cavity. If it is, oftentimes she's bleeding or she's having pain. So there's some type of suspicion. But for the tubes, it's generally very silent. So it's really important to do a diagnostic test before any intervention takes place, even medication, because you can put somebody on something like Clomid where you're stimulating ovulation, but if she doesn't have an open tube, it's for naught. So that baseline exam it's required that the tube be evaluated before any therapeutic or medication is provided. So FemVue really is important because we're moving the exam. It's less expensive. It's with her provider who's accustomed to delivering products into the uterine cavity. We're using natural saline and air contrast, so there's no radiopaque dye, nothing she could be allergic to, and we're not subjecting her to radiation. We're using ultrasound, and so those things make a difference, and she can get the results real time. So the physician will know if there's an issue with her tube during that exam, as opposed to having to wait for the radiologist to write up a report and send it in. So everything can be done in the same visit, and then treatment planning can begin, which is important when somebody is infertile and wants to get pregnant yesterday. How do we make sure that we're timely and that we're giving them the answers that we need so that treatment planning can be handled accordingly?
If fallopian tubes can be unblocked, or they just make a plan for using the other tube?
So it's actually, it's possible to, if it's mucus or something that's movable in the tube, it's a known possibility with exams like FemVue and the radiology exam. It's called an HSG, hysterosalpingogram. Those exams have high pressure with their contrast. So it's known that you can move that mucus out of the way. And there have been examples. I've talked to patients actually by way of physicians that call and say, you need to talk to this patient and hear this amazing story where we just had one recently where the patient was infertile 16 months, had a FemVue, pregnant. 2 years later,
Gosh.
3 years later, infertile again, FemVue, pregnant. So this is the first example of a patient I've heard that has gotten pregnant twice after a FemVue, but I've heard several stories of women that have gotten pregnant. Now it can happen. It's not always going to happen, but it is a possibility. And certainly it's a baseline exam. So it's the first step.
Yeah. It's kind of, you guys clean their pipes out essentially, kind of, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Oh
Exactly.
my goodness. Oh my goodness. This is so cool. So I have a question about this permanent birth control. It's something we really haven't talked about on the show. All I know is that women get their tubes tied. I know that that's probably, no one's in there probably making sailor knots out of fallopian tubes, right? So what does a tubes tied mean? Like what's the current standard of care?
So laparoscopic tubal ligation. So they go in laparoscopically in small incisions, but incisions nonetheless, full general anesthesia done in the hospital setting. And then they go in and they generally cauterize the tube. So burn them and then place a clip or a ring. So there is something left behind because if they just cauterize, sometimes those tubes come together and recannulize and women get pregnant post tubal ligation. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. It's an amazing thing, the body, right? But yeah, so rings and clips are generally used and left behind. And then she's sewed back up and done. And so there is recovery time. She has to come out from anesthesia. So there's anesthetic risk, there's incisions, it's surgery, so all the risks that are involved there. And, there's post procedure potential issues as well around the incision, fever, infection, etc.
Yeah, I actually wondered about that because cauterizing is burning, right? You're using like a laser, you're burning it. And I kind of imagined in my mind, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm a geneticist, laboratory microbiologist. So I'm not the MD kind. I'm like, if they burnt through these tubes, why? And like the ovaries are just like hanging out, like they're floating around, but it sounds more like you kind of scar it with the burning and then they put some kind of clip or ring. So that's why the ovaries stay in the body too.
Well, the ovaries are separate, right? So, right. And then the tubes, literally they do cauterize them and separate them. And they want to make sure that they don't reconnect.
So they are not even connected anymore to the uterus at all?
Cauterized, ring over. I mean, there's different techniques, but the goal is to make sure that they do not reconnect.
Wow, interesting. And I mean, for our listeners who, maybe new or they don't know all the biology, women still have their periods, right? Even when they have this done, right?
Yes.
And so, you kind of described it like it's this big to do, right? When it's a surgery, right? She's going under anesthesia, she's getting her organs cauterized and rings put in and permanent, so what could be, first of all, why do women do this if eventually they'll hit menopause? Why would they do this in the meantime?
I mean, most of the temporary birth controls require some type of regimen, right? Daily pills, rings, patches. Majority of the most common ones are hormonally based. And what we know, which is on every one of the packaging, as women age over the age of 35, particularly, we're at higher risk for blood clots, we're at higher risk for breast cancer. So remaining on the hormones as we age is actually can be very problematic. And so having an option if you're done, female sterilization actually is the most common approach. When you additively look at the number of women that have undergone it, it's roughly 800,000 women a year. That
in the United States or in the world?
In the US. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Now, I'm sure the pandemic is going to affect these numbers. We don't know what that's going to look like since they're elective hospital procedures, but that's been a pretty stable number year over year, about 800,000. So
do you know how many men get their tubes tied? I forget what they call it.
Well, vasectomy, and it's about 500,000
okay
every year as well, but it's also surgery. And honestly, I really think if there's a suitable option for women, that men will step aside and let their female partner take care of it. And just, I mean, women generally are the ones that are burdened with the contraceptive options. I mean, we look at birth control pills and patches, and, IUDs are a good example. I mean, it's meant to be temporary, a reversible method, bridge someone between children as an example. And we're seeing a lot of use of IUDs. The market share leaders hormonally based, and women will get 2, 3, 4 of these to bridge themselves to menopause, and an implant's left behind for 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, whichever the particular product that they choose, and it's hormonally based with those risks that I've already mentioned. So FemBloc is placed very similar to an IUD. So we think someone who would elect to have an IUD would find perhaps FemBloc to be a suitable option. It's placed very similarly through the cervix into the uterine cavity, and we don't leave anything behind but a temporary biopolymer that degrades over time. And what we leave behind as the ultimate solution is scar tissue, which is not so dissimilar from what we see people have when they're infertile by way of an STD. So we know that they're generally asymptomatic, and it's very durable. And so that was what we set out to do, is leave nothing behind, no implant. You mentioned meshes. There's lots of examples in women's health. You leave something behind that was supposed to be permanent, it starts to degrade, it presents safety issues, problems. So we just wanted to develop a procedure that we knew that most women would find very tolerable. So we made it akin to an IUD, and then the next step up was to make sure we didn't leave anything behind and create scar tissue so that women could rely on it for the duration through to menopause.
So it's a special kind of material, biopolymer, you said. Can you tell us more about that? How does that work?
So it is delivered as a liquid. It is a tissue adhesive. It does turn into a solid when it arrives at the tissue. So it stops moving down the tube, and we only need a small amount into the tube. The fallopian tubes are very small, like the size of spaghetti. So the majority of Yep, very tiny, 1 to 2 millimeters. So a lot of people don't know that. And of course, the cavity is much larger. So the bulk of the material is delivered to the opening of the tube, so in contact with the uterine cavity, and then a small remnant amount will go into the tube to affect that kind of response that I mentioned. So it's really a wound healing response. And then we leave behind scar tissue, and the biopolymer just degrades into small particulate and leaves.
And where in the process is FemBloc in development?
So we, many years into this now, but we've amassed a significant amount of data in a safety data set, which became very important given what happened with the predecessor product. So we have we had 183 patients in a safety data set, so quite substantive in number, and we're following them out 5 years. So what we've seen in that data set is whatever adverse events or safety concerns that may have occurred, they occurred majority of them within day 7, and most of them on the first day. The events fell into primarily 2 categories: some spotting and bleeding, and some pain and cramping, which is very customary anytime something is delivered into the uterine cavity. So the safety profile we're pretty happy about. And we are currently have an active trial right now where our patients are undergoing 2 confirmatory tests, the radiology test and our ultrasound test. So we can once and for all compare the 2 and bring the best test forward. And our hopes is that that will be the ultrasound test for the obvious reasons that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Women, is there a trend of women changing their mind after things like this? It's permanent, right? It's technically permanent.
So women are counseled heavily on, are you sure you want permanent? There are a small percentage of women that may change their mind. We we're also very proud of this. This is a bar we set as well. We leave no harm. So we didn't want to, we made sure we don't affect the uterine cavity. So should she require future intervention, if she ends up having bleeding problems, as an example, she can get that intervention because we don't have anything in the uterine cavity, nothing protruding into the cavity, like some of the technologies that came before us. She could also get an IVF. So if because she was fertile, she has no problems with her uterine cavity. If for some reason in that very small percentage of cases, that door is still open.
How interesting. Do you, besides just being, and not just, I don't mean to diminish that whatsoever, but like it being a better option than what's currently available, does this technology like empower women in other ways, or like, is this have impact in the world in a way I'm not thinking of, besides like, and don't get burnt in surgery, like this is more convenient and better for you? Is there other impacts this could have?
Well, I mean, I think it's so empowering because we're developing a non-surgical approach. So it truly has worldwide applicability. There's no surgery suite. It's done in an office environment. So women can have access to something permanent, where in markets, particularly around the world, that's an impossibility or it's extremely dangerous. And we've all heard stories of what's happened in other countries where women have undergone surgical procedures for this, a tubal ligation, and have not fared well as a result. So empowering women to be able to get something, we leave nothing behind. There's no incisions. There's no way anyone would even know that she had the procedure, as an example. And for some countries, that's important. And I think empowering women to be able to control the number of children that they have is extremely empowering. I mean, we think about the demand on natural resources, what that looks like. We think about countries where women are having 7 kids and they're babies themselves, right? And babies are raising babies because they don't end up, surviving some of those pregnancies. So being able to have a healthy outlook and then not subjecting them to things like hormones when they're done. How do we get people off of medications like that when it's not necessary? How do we take that out of the equation? So this empowers them to be able to do all of that.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. What do you see as the future of Femasys?
We have clinical work ahead of us. FemBloc is going to require our next trial after the one I mentioned that we're currently performing right now is the trial that we'll seek approval for. So I see clinical heavy for us. We have an infertility product that we didn't really touch on, but it's very similar to FemBloc and how it delivers to the patient. And in that product, it's called FemaSeed. We're delivering sperm directly to the fallopian tube. So in FemBloc's case, we deliver the biopolymer. In this case, we deliver the sperm, and conception happens in the tube. And women ovulate naturally on one side or the other, which is also very easily detectable under ultrasound. So they can tell where the mature follicle is, and then we can put the sperm right where it needs to go. And we think that's going to improve pregnancy rates because the current approach is the oldest approach for assisted reproductive care, and it's antiquated. And so that is our goal, to kind of advance medicine with that particular product. And we're in a clinical trial for that one right now as well. And we'll seek to have that wrapped up next year. So we'll be at the point where we will be able to potentially commercialize this therapeutic option alongside of our already available FemVue for infertility while we're working on FemBloc, and then FemBloc will come thereafter and bring these solutions to the OB-GYN. So what I envision ultimately happening as we hit these milestones and as we bring these technologies forward is that we have the potential to change the face of gynecology and how women receive their care. We can empower gynecologists in their office to be able to do more treatments and procedures, which is where they want to be. And women will have safer, easier, more convenient, more affordable options afforded to them for these key needs. And we want to be able to do that and then fill the pipeline with other necessary products that may not have as big of a market potential by way of dollars. So they're not going to make it on their own, but if they can come into the fold, we can offer those types of solutions in totality to the same call point. There really isn't anything for the OBGYNs right now. There's nothing new.
Yeah.
So
really interesting. I didn't anticipate this being an episode about the fallopian tubes. Did you realize, like, do you realize how your company is based on fallopian tubes? Is that like a special passion, or did you know that, or one day you looked back and you said, oh, damn, we're working on tubes?
Well, I mean, it just, yeah, I don't think I explicitly said, let's work on tubes, but I think it's, reproductive health. How do we bring forward, and the tubes are such an essential part, right? Because it's a conduit for the ovaries and the cavity. And it's one of the things that, I think went amiss when we look at all of the technology that's been developed for the cavity and bleeding, fibroid management, all of that.
Ovulation and
exactly. The tubes have kind of gone to the wayside. Yeah. So yes, no one's really phrased it that way, Brittany. So
go tubes. Yeah.
Go tubes. Go tubes. I like it.
And they're little spaghetti sized.
Yep. 1 to 2 millimeters at that front end. They get bigger at the end, well, they catch the egg coming from the ovaries, but they get really tiny as they're coming towards the uterine cavity.
So fascinating. One question about that insemination device before we hit our last 2 questions that our listeners love. The insemination device, I've heard of intracervical insemination and then intrauterine insemination. Is intrafallopian tube but like a whole new category, or is that kind of the same as intrauterine?
So we technically deliver to the uterine cavity. We just do it in a specific location. Mm-hmm. So the current intrauterine devices are very undirected. And when I mentioned, it's like the size of spaghetti, the path of least resistance is to stay in the uterine cavity because that's a much bigger area, right? And so that undirected approach has low digit success rates. So what we're doing is placing in the uterine cavity, but right at the opening, and allowing for the sperm by way of the delivery to enter into the tube where it is a safe area. Sperm can live there up to 72 hours, and conception happens in the fallopian tube. So it is their point of destination, and we are ensuring that they get there so they have a chance to do the job that they need to do. That's basically what we're doing. We're cutting the journey and making it very specific so they don't get confused and go to the wrong side. We're deliberate as far as where we deliver the sperm, and we can see it by way of the ultrasound. So ultrasound technology is really enabling us a lot as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like a Lyft driver dropping you off at your gate versus just the airport, right? Yeah. Very cool. Well, our last 2 questions I'd love to ask you about is the first being, we have a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs that listen, a lot of university graduate students. We see you, we love you. You're the future of women's health. Thank you for caring. But they're curious. What should I make? What's left in women's health that needs innovating? So what's an area in women's health that you think still needs innovation?
I mean, there's a number of areas, specifically in the office. I mean, that's where we're targeting. This is where I see medicine's deployment is most favorable when you think of healthcare economics, when you think of safety. So there's a lot of improvements to be made. I mean, I mentioned our Endocervical Sampler as an example. I mean, it's just these are age-old ways in which things have been approached. So there's lots of opportunities, even the speculum, and there's been some attempts at that. I mean, just everything you could imagine being done. How do we do it better? How do we bring it into this century, into this time, and how do we leverage other technologies that have been advanced in other specialties and utilize it in women's health? So I think there are a number of opportunities. I guess more specifically, when we look at bleeding management as an example, we don't have a true office-based approach. So that's an area. I mean, women do contend with bleeding, and as we get older, it gets erratic, it can get heavy, it can get, it can become problematic. There are surgical approaches to that. They're done in outpatient surgery centers, they're done in the hospital as an example. What would it look like if there could be a quick procedure for that in an office? All the different various issues that women contend with. Is there a way to approach it and do it in the safest manner and deliver it in that office environment? Then women will have better access to it.
Yep. So listeners, I hear accessibility to treatment and convenience of treatment. And how does she not have to go under anesthesia? How can it just be performed by a doctor in her regular appointment?
Yep.
Yeah, healthcare delivery, absolutely. And our last question is, what do you think the FemTech industry as a whole needs the most right now in order to be successful?
I mean, it's like a chicken and egg. I think we need people advancing technologies in women's health, but we also need people to invest in women's health. And there's ESG focus now and lots of tailwinds around women's health and discussion, you doing what you do, which is so important to get the word out, but amassing that support and seeing some wins in women's health, I think will be important. But other specialties, they some of these investments, investors are investing in companies that have preclinical data, and then foregoing companies that have clinical data, because women's health is not the darling of Wall Street. But we need more investors to see the opportunity for what it is. We're 51% of the population. It's important. And we have different reproductive needs. I mean, we've built differently. And so there's just, and then that will enable technologies to come off the sidelines and get advanced. But again, I think it's a chicken and egg. When things don't make it, they didn't get funding, perhaps, or maybe they were the wrong approach. But until we see better funding in women's health, I don't think this gets fixed.
Absolutely. Money, 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 y'all. We need the money. We can't move forward without it. So,
Yep.
Kathy, thank you so much for all you do for women's health. Thank you for being a pioneer. Thank you for being successful in your endeavors to, create more convenient, accessible products for women. It is so awesome to have interviewed you, have you on the show, publicly traded company. I love having big success stories, and you are definitely one of them. So thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Brittany. I really appreciate it.